Imagine waking up one morning, only to realize that the year isn't what it should be. It's not the year you left behind. It's not even the year you recognize. Your clock reads 536 AD, a year that, historically, is considered one of the worst in human history. No, this isn't some post-apocalyptic dream. You've somehow landed in a time so dark, so devastating, that every moment could be your last. Now, picture this. As you step outside, the sky is a strange, eerie shade. The sun is hidden, gone, like a celestial curtain has descended, blocking out its warmth. The world around you seems frozen, as if it's been trapped in time, shivering in an endless winter. You can't feel the sun on your skin, no matter how hard you try. It's cold, unnaturally cold. You see people around you, their faces pale with fear and confusion, walking aimlessly, unsure of how to survive. And in the distance, you hear whispers, rumors of famine, plague, and death. You might be thinking, how could this happen? Wasn't the world supposed to be advancing? Wasn't civilization moving forward? But no, this is the year when everything started to unravel. This is the year when nature turned against humanity, and civilization itself teetered on the edge of collapse. What if I told you that the year 536 AD was the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in history, a time when vast empires crumbled, disease spread like wildfire, and people looked to the heavens for answers, not knowing whether they would survive another day? Imagine the horror of being caught in the middle of it all. It was a time of plague, starvation, and darkness. But it wasn't just nature's wrath that brought people to their knees. It was the complete breakdown of societies, the fall of once great empires, and the terror of the unknown that consumed humanity. In 536 AD, humanity was not only fighting the elements, but also itself. A virus like no other spread across continents. The year marked the beginning of an age where survival seemed impossible. And as if that weren't enough, what you'll discover is that the consequences of this catastrophic year didn't just end there. They spread like ripples in a pond, influencing everything from the way people lived to the very rise of new civilizations. But let me ask you, what would you do if you woke up in a world like that? A world with no sun, no hope, and no certainty about what tomorrow might bring? Stay with me, because the true story of what happened in 536 AD is far more shocking than you could ever imagine. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a glimpse into a world that may very well feel like the world we're living in today. And what's more unsettling is that some of the events from that time echo in our world right now. As we journey through this ancient catastrophe, you'll come to realize that the darkest years of humanity might not be as far behind us as we think. So, keep watching, because the true horrors of 536 AD are just getting started. It was a year like no other. In the year 536 AD, a phenomenon occurred that would change the course of human history forever. The skies, once filled with the warmth of the sun, suddenly grew dark. It wasn't the darkness of night that covered the world, but an unrelenting twilight that stretched across the globe for nearly a year. People awoke to a strange, eerie dimness, where the sun seemed to be trapped behind a thick veil, casting everything in an unnatural, haunting gloom. At first, there were whispers. The sky had been clouded for a few days. Surely it would pass, they thought. But it didn't. The days dragged on, and the sun never fully rose. Instead, a dull, gray haze shrouded the earth, and what had once been a bright, life-giving force became a distant memory. The phenomenon was a volcanic eruption, though no one at the time understood the cause. The eruption had been massive, releasing ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, which blocked the sun's rays. The world, it seemed, was plunged into a perpetual twilight. In the cities, people looked up in bewilderment. Farmers, once accustomed to the rhythms of the seasons, found their crops wilting before their eyes. The warmth of summer never came, and in its place, an unnatural cold set in. Temperatures dropped. It wasn't just the chilly air. It was as though the earth itself had grown cold, a world frozen in time. People tried to explain what was happening, but there was no rational explanation, no way to make sense of the invisible force that had taken hold. For the people living in the Eastern Roman Empire, especially in places like Constantinople, life was unbearable. The constant gloom seeped into the hearts of the citizens, stripping them of hope. The warmth of the sun had always been something they took for granted, something that held the promise of life, of crops, of good harvests. Now, it was nothing more than a faded memory. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, uncertain of what would come next. In the countryside, farmers and villagers felt the effects of the darkness more sharply. They relied on the sun for their livelihood, and without it, they were powerless. The once fertile soil, the grains and vegetables that had flourished in the warmth, withered away. Their crops failed, livestock starved, unable to graze on the scanty vegetation that remained. Desperation took root, as people clung to the hope that the sun would return. But it didn't. As the months passed, the darkness did not lift. What had once been a community, dependent on the sun's reliable rise each morning, was now a society struggling to understand how they had been abandoned by the very force that had kept them alive for centuries. The world seemed to be holding its breath, as though waiting for something, anything, that would end this nightmare. But there was no end in sight. In the heart of the Roman Empire, the news spread quickly. The Emperor Justinian I had already been dealing with his own battles, both political and military. Now, he faced a crisis unlike any before. The very climate of his empire had turned against him. The emperor's advisors were scrambling, but there were no answers. The darkness that had fallen over the empire was beyond their control. It wasn't just the peasants and farmers suffering. The entire empire, from the grand cities to the rural villages, was feeling the impact. The common people were not the only ones in despair. In the grand palaces, where once the emperor had been surrounded by opulence and extravagance, now there was an air of uncertainty. This disaster had not been foreseen by anyone. For the first time in history, the mighty Roman Empire, the civilization that had withstood so much, was being confronted by something it could not conquer, something it could not control. But as terrifying as it was, this was just the beginning. As the days turned to weeks, and the weeks stretched into months, the consequences of the sun's disappearance became more apparent. The world had entered into an age of hunger, a time when the very foundation of human survival, agriculture, was disrupted in the most devastating way. Crops that once flourished under the golden rays of the sun began to wither. Fields of wheat, barley, and rice turned to dust. The earth itself seemed to rebel against its people, leaving them to starve. The first signs of famine were subtle. It wasn't as though the world suddenly ran out of food. Instead, the crops that people relied on began to fail, slowly at first. But with each passing day, the situation worsened. What had once been a steady rhythm of planting and harvesting became a battle for survival. Farmers, in their desperation, tried to save their fields by working harder, but no matter what they did, the results were the same. The soil yielded nothing. No matter how much they worked the land, nothing could grow. The world was suffocating, its very breath stolen by the thick blanket of ash in the sky. In the cities, the rich and poor alike felt the impact of the famine. Trade routes that had once been bustling with the exchange of goods and food came to a halt. The great markets of the world stood empty, their stalls bare. Food became a rare commodity, and what little was available came at a price that only the wealthiest could afford. But even the rich couldn't escape the grasp of the disaster. The inability to produce food led to astronomical prices. Bread, the staple of every meal, was becoming a luxury. The average person could no longer afford to feed their family. Desperation turned to panic. In the streets of Constantinople and other major cities, crowds of people gathered, demanding food, demanding help, but there was none to be given. The empire's rulers, who once held absolute power, now found themselves helpless in the face of this global catastrophe. There was no army to send, no taxes to levy, no diplomacy to be had. The emperor's decrees could no longer feed the people. All that was left was hunger, an ever-present gnawing emptiness that consumed everyone. But even as food became scarce, the most frightening part of the famine was the silence that followed. The people who had once been vibrant and full of life, driven by their daily routines, now found themselves consumed by survival. They could no longer talk of art, philosophy, or war. They spoke only of food, of what they had lost, and what they feared they would never have again. The streets were quieter. The laughter of children, the clink of metal tools, the hum of daily life, all of it had been replaced by a kind of deathly stillness. People walked with their heads down, not looking at each other, afraid to ask for help, because no one had anything left to give. The rich, who once sat in their marble palaces surrounded by luxuries, now faced the same fate as the poor. The great estates were abandoned, as the land could no longer support anything but despair. The emperor's wealth, his armies, and his legions were meaningless in the face of such a catastrophe. The once great cities now resembled ghost towns, their palaces and buildings silent and vacant. And still, the darkness lingered. No one knew when it would end. In the countryside, people abandoned their farms, leaving behind their homes in search of food. The great cities were choked with refugees, but there was nowhere for them to go. The hunger spread like wildfire, and it wasn't just the people who suffered. Animals starved, and those that remained were driven to madness, attacking anything in sight in a desperate bid to find sustenance. The people of 536 AD had no idea when, or even if, the sun would return. All they knew was that their world, their once ordered lives, had been torn apart by forces beyond their comprehension. And as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks stretched into months, they could only wonder, was this the end of their world? Would humanity survive? Or would this great famine mark the beginning of the end? In these bleak times, people turned to their gods for answers. Priests and religious leaders preached of divine punishment, of the gods testing the hearts of men. Some even began to perform sacrifices, believing that only by offering their most precious possessions could they appease the wrath of the gods. But no divine intervention came. Instead, the people were left with an agonizing question. Why had this happened? What had they done to deserve such suffering? And as the famine continued to spread, something darker began to emerge, a sense of hopelessness. For the first time in centuries, the world seemed to have lost its way. Empires crumbled, cities were abandoned, and people began to wonder if humanity would ever recover from the catastrophe that had befallen them. What had once been an organized, thriving society was now a chaotic, desperate struggle for survival. As the long months of darkness wore on, the world's suffering only deepened. The famine was not the only crisis that humanity faced. A far more sinister threat arrived, one that would further decimate the fragile population, the plague. While the sun remained hidden behind a blanket of ash, disease began to spread like wildfire, taking hold of cities and villages alike. The very air itself seemed to carry death, and the fear of infection became as pervasive as the cold. The plague of Justinian, as it would later be known, swept through the Eastern Roman Empire, but did not stop there. It spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, reaching the far corners of Europe, North Africa, and Asia. It was unlike anything people had ever witnessed. With no understanding of bacteria or viruses, they could only see the terrible symptoms: high fever, swelling of the lymph nodes, and the terrible, blackened spots that covered the skin of the afflicted. The sickness moved quickly, and death was almost certain for those who caught it. The people of 536 AD had no defenses against the plague, no medicines, no antibiotics, no understanding of how disease spread. And so, the bodies began to pile up in the streets. In some places, entire families were wiped out, their homes abandoned, their windows dark. Once thriving cities now lay silent, their streets littered with the remains of those who had succumbed to the disease. The rich, who had once relied on their wealth to shield them from the troubles of the world, found themselves just as vulnerable as the poor. In the face of this epidemic, nothing could protect them. Their great palaces stood empty, as those who once dwelled within them had been taken by the plague. In the worst-hit areas, including the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the clergy and leaders of the church worked tirelessly to offer what little comfort they could. Priests prayed, and the people gathered in churches for solace. But despite their pleas for divine intervention, the plague showed no mercy. It cut through the population like a blade, indifferent to class, wealth, or status. The emperor, Justinian I, was forced to confront a grim reality. His empire was being consumed by forces it could not control. With so many dying, the social fabric began to fray. Trade, already crippled by the failed harvests, came to a halt. The once thriving marketplace in Constantinople, filled with merchants and traders from every corner of the empire, was now eerily empty. The great ships that once sailed from port to port now sat idle, their sails torn by time and neglect. The bustling trade routes, which had connected east to west, were no longer a source of wealth. They were a source of fear. Any attempt to travel was met with suspicion, as the plague seemed to follow wherever the people went. The toll the plague took on society was staggering. It is believed that between 25% and 50% of the population in the Byzantine Empire was wiped out, and the death toll across Europe and Asia was in the millions. The death of so many people brought with it a profound change in the way people viewed life. The once proud cities were now empty shells, haunted by memories of what had once been. The laughter of children, the voices of traders calling out in the streets. These things were silenced by the grim specter of death that loomed over every corner of the world. As the plague ravaged the earth, the people began to wonder, what was the purpose of it all? Why had this happened? Had they angered the gods? Or was this simply the way of the world, a cruel twist of fate that no one could understand? The answers remained elusive, lost in the swirling mists of time. What was clear, however, was that humanity was now on the edge of an abyss, one that seemed to stretch out endlessly before them. For those who survived the plague, the world would never be the same. The once thriving civilizations were shattered, their greatness lost to time. The great libraries of Alexandria, the intellectual centers of Rome and Constantinople, were reduced to rubble. What was once a world filled with ideas, art, and culture had now become a world of survival, where every day was a fight against death itself. As the plague slowly began to recede, it left behind a world forever changed. The population had been decimated, the social order shattered, and the remnants of the great empires were left to pick up the pieces. But in the midst of this destruction, something else was beginning to take shape, something that would define the future of humanity. The survivors, scarred by the horrors they had witnessed, would rise from the ashes to build new societies, new civilizations, and new ways of life. But first, they would have to reckon with the darkness that had nearly consumed them. The year 537 AD was no better than its predecessor. In fact, it felt as though the earth had swallowed any hope that had remained from the previous year. The sun still remained hidden behind a veil of ash, and the people of the world were left in a constant state of twilight. But by 537, the effects of the darkened skies had transformed from a mere inconvenience into a full-blown disaster. As the months dragged on, the once hopeful whispers of the world would soon return to normal faded into a distant memory. The realization settled in. This was not just a passing storm. This was a global crisis that would change the course of history. People had already endured a harsh winter, their crops destroyed by the bitter cold. But now, with the summer months approaching, it became clear that the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. In the cities, the wealthy who had once lived in luxury found themselves struggling for survival. Their stores of food, once ample and overflowing, were rapidly depleting. The trade routes that had once connected the great civilizations of the world were now all but useless, as ships sat idly in harbors, unable to cross the oceans to bring much-needed supplies. In the absence of trade, famine spread like wildfire, as food became a rare and precious commodity. For the poor, the situation was even more dire. With crops failing and food prices skyrocketing, the common people found themselves trapped in a relentless cycle of hunger and desperation. The once bustling markets, where people had haggled and bartered for goods, were now eerily silent. There were no more fresh fruits or vegetables, no grains to be ground into flour. People could no longer even afford the basics of life. In rural areas, where farmers had once tilled the land with hope in their hearts, the situation was even worse. With no food to harvest, many abandoned their fields, their homes, and their villages in search of a better life. But there was no better life to be found. The cities, once hubs of culture and civilization, were now overrun with refugees, all seeking shelter from the devastation of the outside world. But the cities, too, were struggling to feed their own people. The influx of refugees only worsened the already dire situation, as resources were stretched thinner than ever. In some places, entire villages were abandoned, left to rot in the shadow of what had once been thriving communities. What had once been lush farmland was now barren, and the land itself seemed to turn against the people who had relied on it for survival. The hope that things would get better, that the sun would return to its rightful place in the sky, seemed more like a dream that was slipping further and further away with each passing day. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this global crisis was the uncertainty that came with it. No one knew how long this would last. No one knew when, or even if, the sun would return. The darkness had become a part of life. People had learned to live with it, but it had stolen something from them. The fear of the unknown had taken root in their hearts. There was no way of knowing if they would survive this dark period, or if they would simply become another chapter in the long, painful history of humanity. The empire's leadership, once strong and steady, now seemed ineffectual in the face of this crisis. Emperor Justinian I, already stretched thin with the ongoing wars and the collapse of his empire's economy, now faced a new, unimaginable threat: the survival of his people. He had no answers. His advisors had no answers. The empire's armies, once feared across the world, could do little to stem the tide of hunger and disease that was sweeping across the land. The situation only worsened when reports began to come in from the farthest reaches of the empire. What had begun as a localized disaster had become a global one. The darkness, the famine, and the plague were not just affecting one part of the world. They were ravaging every corner of the earth. In places like Persia, China, and India, people were facing the same horrors. The great civilizations of the East were not immune to the disaster. It was as though the world itself had been plunged into chaos, and no one knew how to find their way out. By 538 AD, the harsh reality of the world's suffering had begun to settle deeply into every corner of society. The year had come and gone without any sign of hope. The darkness, still unyielding, had cast its shadow over the earth for more than a full year. The sun was still hidden, and what little light managed to break through the ashen skies offered little warmth. People began to speak of this time as an age of living death, a world caught in a never-ending dusk. The effects of the extended winter, coupled with the absence of sunlight, did not simply end with the failure of crops. It rippled through every aspect of life. The longer the darkness persisted, the more profound its impact became. The economic structures that had once underpinned civilizations began to crack under the pressure. Trade networks that had spanned continents broke down. In the absence of goods and food, the markets collapsed. The global economy faltered, and the stability that had existed in the previous centuries crumbled to dust. One of the most immediate and devastating consequences of this breakdown was the plague, which continued to spread uncontrollably. What was once confined to specific regions had now become a global pandemic, devastating populations far and wide. The people of 538 AD were not just living under the darkened sky. They were also living under the specter of death that followed in the wake of the plague. In the cities, the once thriving marketplaces, where food and other goods had been readily available, now stood silent. The streets, once filled with the hustle and bustle of daily life, were empty, save for the occasional wanderer or refugee. The disease had taken hold of the people, and they were paralyzed by fear. Entire families had perished, entire neighborhoods wiped out. There was no medicine to offer comfort, no physician who could promise a cure. People, in their desperation, resorted to any method they could think of to try to protect themselves, but none worked. The air felt thick with the presence of death, and everywhere people looked, they saw only reminders of their fragility. In the face of this catastrophic decline, even the once glorious Roman Empire seemed to be on the brink of collapse. Emperor Justinian, the leader who had once sought to revive the empire's former glory, was now struggling to maintain any semblance of control. The Eastern Roman Empire, once an economic powerhouse, was in disarray. Cities that had flourished for centuries now lay in ruins, their grandeur fading as the people were consumed by fear and disease. The emperor's own capital, Constantinople, was no longer a shining beacon of power. It had become a city of despair, filled with refugees from surrounding regions, each one seeking sanctuary from the plague and famine. The city's once vibrant streets were now filled with the sick and dying. Those who could afford to flee did so, seeking refuge in the countryside or in other parts of the empire. But even in these areas, there was little hope. The countryside, too, was grappling with its own set of problems. The land, once fertile and productive, was now barren. The crops that had failed the previous year had not grown back, and without food to feed them, even the poorest could not survive. The rich, who had once relied on their wealth and power to shield them from disaster, found themselves just as vulnerable as the rest. Their estates were abandoned, their great homes turned into ghostly shells, empty and desolate. The social fabric, once so tightly woven, began to unravel. People turned on one another as the crisis deepened. In times of desperation, survival instincts take over, and the bonds that once united communities began to fray. Neighbors, who had once shared meals and conversations, now eyed one another with suspicion. Food became more than just a necessity. It became a commodity for which people were willing to do anything. There were reports of thefts, violence, and even the unthinkable, families abandoning their elderly and sick, too overwhelmed by their own struggles to care for others. In this bleak environment, the wealthy were no longer immune. The great feasts, once enjoyed in opulent palaces, had long since ended. What had once been a time of excess had become a time of survival. The rich could no longer rely on their wealth to shield them. In the face of hunger and disease, gold and jewels were of little use. Instead, it was the people's ability to adapt to their circumstances, to survive against all odds, that would determine their fate. In the absence of sunlight, food, and safety, people began to look for answers. The uncertainty of the times led many to search for explanations. Religious leaders, many of whom had once been symbols of hope and comfort, were now viewed with skepticism. Some preached that the darkness was a divine punishment, a test from the gods. Others saw it as a sign of the end times, a warning that humanity had gone too far and now faced its reckoning. But the darkness persisted, and as it stretched on, so did the suffering. People had once believed that humanity's greatest strength was its ability to adapt, to overcome any obstacle. But in 538 AD, that belief was put to the test in the most harrowing way possible. Could humanity survive a world where the sun itself seemed to have abandoned them? As the world continued to grapple with the horrors of 537 to 538 AD, the darkness, both literal and metaphorical, seemed to press down on every aspect of life. It wasn't just a time of survival, but of transformation. The once clear lines of civilization, which had been so meticulously drawn through empires and kingdoms, were now blurred by a world on the brink of collapse. The people of this age would forever be defined by their resilience or their despair, depending on where they stood when the tides of history finally receded. In the absence of order and stability, new realities began to emerge. Those who had once lived under the protection of empires, kingdoms, and established governments found themselves thrust into a world of uncertainty. The great cities, their walls once symbolic of power and security, now stood vulnerable and hollow, their gates wide open to the chaos that surrounded them. In the absence of strong leadership, local communities began to take matters into their own hands, but there was no guarantee that this would lead to survival. In the far reaches of the Byzantine Empire, people began to seek refuge in the countryside, away from the decimated urban centers. They were not simply fleeing the disease and famine. They were also fleeing the collapse of civilization itself. The very concept of empire, once unshakable, had been shattered by events beyond human control. And so, in the countryside, small pockets of society began to form, more concerned with survival than with the grandeur of past glory. Some of these rural communities were built on old ways of life: agriculture, local trade, and mutual support. These pockets of resistance, though small, became the breeding grounds for new ideas. The land, which had once been a source of wealth for the elite, now became the lifeblood of those struggling to make a living. There was no longer any room for luxury, for the delicate fabrics of culture and refinement that had once been hallmarks of society. Survival was now the primary concern. Meanwhile, in the wake of the plague and famine, the social hierarchy that had once governed the Roman Empire was dismantled. The very structure of society had become irrelevant. The emperor, once the most powerful man in the world, was now a figurehead, unable to prevent the collapse that had spread across his lands. And the once unbreakable chain of command, which had ensured that the upper classes remained in power, was broken. For the first time in centuries, the common people found themselves with a voice, however faint, and it was in their hands that the future would be shaped. But while the old world was crumbling, new forces were beginning to rise. In the east, the Islamic Caliphate, still in its early stages, was beginning to gather strength. In the west, the remnants of the Roman Empire, now divided and fractured, were slowly giving way to the rise of new kingdoms and territories. These new powers, though born of desperation and decay, would eventually shape the future of the known world. The people of 537 to 538 AD, faced with insurmountable odds, had no idea that the world they knew would never return. Yet, from the ashes of the old world, new ideas, new societies, and new empires would eventually emerge. These emerging forces, forged in the fires of hardship and disaster, would prove to be the catalyst for change. They would pave the way for the Middle Ages and, eventually, the Renaissance, periods of cultural rebirth and intellectual flourishing that would stand in stark contrast to the devastation of the 6th century. In many ways, the events of 536 to 538 AD marked the end of an era, a time when the old world order collapsed under the weight of its own fragility. But they also marked the beginning of something else, a new world order, born from the ruins of the old, that would change the course of history forever. The people of this time, though faced with unimaginable hardship, would be the ones to lay the groundwork for the rise of new powers, new ideas, and a new future. And so, while 536 AD will always be remembered as a year of darkness, it was also a year that set the stage for the world that would emerge from the wreckage. The aftershocks of this great catastrophe would reverberate through the centuries, shaping the trajectory of human civilization for generations to come. In the wake of the darkened skies and the famine that had gripped the world for years, the ancient world faced yet another threat, one that would devastate entire populations and bring many civilizations to their knees. The plague of Justinian, a terrifying and relentless disease, arrived in the Eastern Roman Empire in 540 AD. What had begun as whispers of a distant illness soon became a nightmare that swept through cities, villages, and towns across the empire. It wasn't just the darkness and the cold that people feared anymore. The plague spread like wildfire, and with it came death. The disease had a name, but no one understood how it worked. The symptoms were unmistakable: sudden fever, painful swelling of the lymph nodes, and black spots that marked the body like a death sentence. The plague of Justinian was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though the people of the time had no concept of germs, bacteria, or viruses. All they knew was that it was a plague of unimaginable scope, and it was spreading at a terrifying pace. In Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the first signs of the plague were barely noticed. At first, it seemed like any other illness that swept through the crowded streets of the city. But within weeks, it became clear that something much more sinister was at play. The plague didn't discriminate. It struck the poor, the rich, and even the emperor's own officials. It didn't care about status, wealth, or power. It simply took the lives of those it touched. The city's once thriving markets, which had been filled with merchants selling their wares from every corner of the empire, were now eerily silent. The sound of life that had filled the streets was replaced with an unsettling stillness. People began to avoid one another, terrified of being the next victim. Families abandoned their loved ones in fear, and the sick were left to die alone. In the most extreme cases, the bodies piled up so quickly that they were simply thrown into mass graves, buried in the shadows of the city's once beautiful churches. The plague spread rapidly across the empire, reaching the farthest reaches of the Byzantine world. It didn't stop at the empire's borders. It spread westward into Italy, Spain, and North Africa, and eastward into Persia and beyond. Within a few short years, it had claimed millions of lives. The world that had once been so vibrant and filled with the promise of progress was now a land of death, where every day brought new grief and suffering. The death toll from the plague was staggering. Some estimates suggest that as much as 25 to 50% of the population of the Byzantine Empire perished, and in some regions, the mortality rate was even higher. The disease spread rapidly along trade routes, which had once been bustling with the exchange of goods and ideas. Now, those same trade routes became vectors for the plague spread, taking death and disease across the known world. In the midst of this devastation, Emperor Justinian I faced an empire on the brink of collapse. The once great civilization that he had sought to restore was now unraveling before his eyes. The plague had crippled his army, leaving him vulnerable to foreign invaders. The economy, which had once been a source of wealth and power, was now in ruins. The people, who had once looked to their emperor for guidance, now saw him as helpless, unable to stop the relentless march of death. But the emperor was not one to give up easily. Despite the overwhelming odds, he tried to maintain control over his empire. He called upon his most trusted generals and officials to hold the empire together, but the plague continued to tear through his ranks. It was as though the very foundations of his power were being eaten away by the disease that had gripped his people. In the streets of Constantinople, as the plague raged on, people began to lose faith in the emperor's ability to protect them. The great palaces that once symbolized the emperor's power were now abandoned, and the people were left to fend for themselves. The fear of death was palpable in every corner of the city, and the cries of the suffering could be heard in the streets, echoing off the walls of the great buildings. This was no longer just a crisis of the body. It was a crisis of the soul. People began to question everything they had once believed in. Was this the punishment of the gods? Or was it a consequence of the human condition itself? The answers were elusive, and the people found themselves turning to their faith, their gods, and their religious leaders for guidance. But even the clergy, the supposed protectors of the soul, were not immune. Many of them perished alongside their followers, leaving the people with no one to turn to. As the plague of Justinian continued to ravage the Eastern Roman Empire, its effects began to spread far beyond the walls of Constantinople. What had begun as a localized outbreak in the Byzantine capital soon escalated into a global catastrophe as the plague moved rapidly across the Mediterranean and into Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. No one was prepared for the overwhelming speed at which the disease would spread, and no one could escape its grasp. The plague traveled along the ancient trade routes that connected the vast empires of the time, moving with the caravans and ships that carried goods, ideas, and people across continents. What had once been a thriving trade network that brought wealth and prosperity to the region now became a highway for death. The same ships that carried luxury goods and supplies to Constantinople now carried the deadly plague back to the ports of Italy, Spain, and North Africa. In the bustling markets of Rome, merchants who had once exchanged goods for coins now found themselves exchanging stares of fear, wondering if their next breath would be their last. The disease arrived in Italy in the summer of 541 AD, and it spread quickly through the population, killing both the rich and the poor with terrifying efficiency. In the span of just a few months, the once vibrant city was reduced to a ghost town, its streets empty and silent, save for the cries of the dying. As the plague swept through Italy, it didn't stop there. It spread westward, crossing the Alps into Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula, and then it traveled southward, reaching North Africa. By the end of 542 AD, the disease had spread throughout the entire Mediterranean region, touching the shores of Africa, the Middle East, and as far east as Persia. It was no longer confined to the Byzantine Empire. It was a global pandemic, and no one was safe. The devastation wrought by the plague was unparalleled. Entire cities were left in ruins, their populations decimated. In North Africa, the great city of Carthage, once a thriving center of commerce and culture, was left abandoned and desolate. The great libraries of Alexandria, which had once been home to some of the most important intellectual works of the ancient world, now stood in ruins, their treasures lost to time and disease. The intellectual and cultural legacy of these great cities was shattered, and their inhabitants were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. As the disease spread, so too did the fear. People lived in constant terror, unsure of when the plague would strike next. The symptoms were terrifying and unmistakable: fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes, and the dreaded black spots that signified the presence of the deadly bacteria. The plague was particularly brutal because it moved so quickly. Those who contracted it often died within a matter of days, leaving little time for medical intervention or comfort. In the cities, the wealthy, who had once been able to shield themselves from the hardships of life, were now just as vulnerable as the poorest peasants. The palaces and estates of the rich were not immune to the plague, and many of the empire's elite fell victim to the disease. The ruling classes, who had once been the epitome of power and control, were now fighting for survival alongside the common folk. No one was safe, and the plague showed no mercy. But the greatest tragedy of all was the toll it took on families. Entire households were wiped out in a matter of days, as mothers, fathers, and children all fell victim to the disease. What had once been vibrant communities were now hollowed-out shells, their streets empty and silent. The human cost of the plague was immeasurable, and the emotional toll it took on survivors was just as devastating. In the midst of this chaos, the religious leaders of the time began to take on an even greater role. People turned to their faith for answers, but the religious institutions, too, were not immune to the disease. Many clergy members died, leaving the people without the spiritual guidance they so desperately needed. The crisis of faith that followed was profound. People who had once been devoted to their gods now questioned whether they had been forsaken. For those who survived the initial wave of the plague, the world was never the same. The survivors were scarred, both physically and emotionally. The trauma of witnessing the death of so many people left a permanent mark on the survivors, and the social fabric of the empire was forever altered. The fear of death, the fear of the plague, remained in the air long after the disease itself had passed. People no longer trusted one another as they once had, and communities were fractured by suspicion and grief. By 543 AD, the plague of Justinian had claimed millions of lives, ravaged entire cities, and reshaped the course of history. Though the immediate horrors of the disease began to fade, the aftermath would reverberate through the centuries, altering the very fabric of society. The world that had emerged from the devastation of the plague was a shadow of its former self, its once vibrant cities reduced to ruins, and its survivors scarred by the trauma they had endured. In the Byzantine Empire, the damage done by the plague was both immediate and long-lasting. The empire's population had been decimated, and its economy lay in shambles. Once thriving trade routes were abandoned, and the vast wealth that had once flowed into Constantinople was now but a distant memory. The markets, which had once been filled with the bustle of merchants from all over the world, now stood silent, their stalls empty. The great cities, where once people had lived in relative comfort, were now nothing more than hollow shells, haunted by the memories of what had been lost. In the countryside, the situation was no better. The plague had ravaged the rural areas just as it had the cities, leaving behind desolate farms and abandoned villages. The land, which had once been a source of wealth and sustenance, was now barren and infertile. Farmers, who had once relied on their crops to survive, now found themselves with nothing but empty fields. What little food remained was hoarded by those who could afford it, and starvation claimed even more lives. The Byzantine army, once a formidable force, was now severely weakened. The plague had taken a heavy toll on the empire's soldiers, leaving the empire vulnerable to external threats. The once mighty army that had defended the empire's borders with such strength and precision was now a shadow of its former self. Even the emperor, Justinian I, who had once been hailed as one of the greatest leaders of his time, found himself unable to halt the decline of his empire. His plans to reconquer the Western Roman Empire were dashed, as his forces were too depleted to continue the fight. But perhaps the most profound effect of the plague was its impact on the people. The survivors, who had lived through the terror and grief of losing so many loved ones, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The emotional toll of the plague was staggering. Families had been torn apart, and communities had been fractured. The very fabric of society had been stretched to its breaking point, and it would take generations for the wounds to heal. In the wake of the plague, new religious movements began to take shape. The sense of fear and uncertainty that had plagued the people for so long led many to seek solace in their faith. Religious leaders, who had once been seen as healers and guides, now took on even greater significance. People looked to them not only for spiritual guidance, but also for answers to the questions that plagued their minds. Why had this happened? What did it mean for the future? As the people sought solace in their faith, the plague also spurred a shift in the way that people viewed life and death. The disease had shown them just how fragile life could be. In the face of death, many began to question the meaning of existence, the afterlife, and the nature of suffering. These questions would fuel the rise of new philosophical and religious ideas that would shape the coming centuries. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, though weakened, was not completely lost. Despite the devastation, the empire managed to survive, though it was never the same. The empire would continue for several centuries, though it would be forever marked by the shadow of the plague. The rise of Islam in the East and the expansion of the Frankish Empire in the West would eventually lead to the transformation of the political landscape in Europe, but the events of the 6th century would forever leave their mark on the world. By 550 AD, the remnants of the once mighty Byzantine Empire were struggling to regain their footing after years of plague, famine, and political turmoil. What had once been a thriving empire, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to parts of North Africa and Italy, was now facing a series of existential threats. While the empire still held its capital, Constantinople, its influence had been drastically reduced. The mighty walls of the city, once a symbol of strength and security, now seemed to stand as monuments to a bygone era. The plague of 536 AD, followed by successive waves of disease and famine, had taken a devastating toll on the empire's population. It wasn't just the sheer loss of life that had shattered the empire, but the long-term consequences of these events. The once vibrant trade routes that had connected Constantinople to the rest of the world were now frail and unreliable. Merchants had fled to safer territories, and cities along the empire's borders had fallen into disarray. At the heart of this crisis was Emperor Justinian I, a man who had once dreamed of restoring the grandeur of the Roman Empire. His ambitious campaign to reconquer the western provinces of the former Roman Empire had initially shown promise, with victories in Italy and North Africa. But by 550 AD, it was clear that these victories had come at a steep cost. The military campaigns that had drained the empire's resources had also strained its manpower. The plague had decimated Justinian's armies, and the financial burden of maintaining a sprawling empire was becoming increasingly unsustainable. In Italy, the great city of Rome, once the beating heart of the Roman Empire, had fallen into ruins. The Gothic Wars, which had begun with the Byzantine attempt to reclaim the western territories, had left the region in tatters. The Gothic forces, weakened by internal strife, had been no match for the Byzantine army, but the war had taken a heavy toll on both sides. The city of Rome, once home to grand architecture, was now a shadow of its former self, with its population decimated and its infrastructure in disrepair. Even as the Byzantines had won military victories, they had done so at the expense of their own resources, further depleting the empire's strength. In the wake of these struggles, the empire's ability to project power across the Mediterranean had been severely weakened. The once unified empire was now fragmented, with its western provinces lost to rival powers. While Justinian still held Constantinople, the empire's borders had shrunk, and its influence had diminished. The once feared Byzantine navy, which had controlled the Mediterranean Sea, was now a pale shadow of its former self. As the empire's grip on the western territories weakened, new powers began to emerge. To the north, the Slavs were advancing into Byzantine territory, threatening the empire's stability even further. In the south, the rise of Islam was beginning to reshape the political landscape of the Mediterranean and beyond. The Arabs, united under the banner of Islam, were rapidly expanding across North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula. The Byzantine Empire, once the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, was now facing challenges from all sides. As the Byzantine Empire began to unravel, a new era was beginning to take shape. The Mediterranean world, once dominated by Roman influence, was now being reshaped by new forces. The rise of Islam, the expansion of the Frankish kingdom in the west, and the increasing strength of the Slavs in the north signaled the end of one world order and the beginning of another. The world of 550 AD was one in which old empires fell and new powers emerged from the ashes of the past. But even as the empire was in decline, Justinian's vision for a unified, prosperous Mediterranean world had not completely disappeared. The emperor's legal reforms, which had been codified in the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, would leave a lasting legacy. These reforms, which had codified Roman law and provided the foundation for much of Western legal thought, would continue to influence European and Mediterranean societies for centuries to come. In many ways, Justinian's legacy was one of paradox. Though the empire he ruled had been weakened by the disasters of the 6th century, his vision of a unified Mediterranean world and his efforts to preserve the memory of Rome would live on, even as the empire itself began to fade. As the Byzantine Empire entered this period of decline, its future would be shaped by the legacies of the past, even as the world around it was changing at an unprecedented rate. While the Byzantine Empire struggled to maintain its hold on the world, new and emerging forces began to rise, gradually reshaping the political and social landscape of the Mediterranean and beyond. The decline of the old order opened the door for new powers, ideologies, and civilizations to take root. Among these, the rise of Islam in the 7th century would prove to be the most significant and transformative. In the East, the spread of Islam was not just a religious movement. It was a political and cultural force that would challenge the Byzantine Empire and its long-standing dominance in the region. By the mid-7th century, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate began to push against the borders of the Byzantine Empire. In 636 AD, the Battle of Yarmouk, a decisive confrontation between the Byzantine forces and the Arab armies, marked the beginning of the loss of Byzantine territory in the eastern Mediterranean. The Arabs, united under the banner of Islam, swept through the Middle East with remarkable speed. By 661 AD, the Caliphate had taken control of much of the Byzantine-held Levant and Egypt, undermining the empire's economic and strategic influence. The once great cities of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria fell under Muslim control. The Eastern Roman Empire, already weakened by years of plague and military struggles, found itself unable to defend these territories. The rise of Islam effectively marked the end of Byzantine rule in many of its most important provinces. While the Byzantines struggled to hold onto their lands, the emergence of the Frankish kingdom in the west began to shift the power dynamics of Europe. Under the leadership of Charlemagne, the Frankish Empire would go on to become a major force in Europe, eventually leading to the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. In 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo III, reviving the title of Emperor in the West for the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This marked the beginning of a new political order in Europe, one that was based on Christian authority and monarchic rule, in stark contrast to the Byzantine system. The Frankish kingdom, like the Islamic Caliphate, was a rising force that would dominate the political landscape of Europe for centuries to come. Charlemagne's conquests expanded the Frankish Empire from modern-day France into Germany, Italy, and beyond. His reign ushered in a period of relative stability in Western Europe, as he sought to unite various tribes and kingdoms under one rule. However, this new power in the West came at the expense of the Byzantine Empire's former influence over the region. The once powerful empire was no longer the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean world. In the north, the Slavs were another rising force that began to exert their influence on the Byzantine Empire. The Slavic people, who had once been relatively unknown to the great empires of the time, began to establish powerful kingdoms in Eastern Europe. By the 6th century, the Slavs had begun to settle along the Danube River and throughout the Balkans, encroaching on Byzantine territory. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal struggles and external threats, was unable to prevent the Slavic expansion, and many regions that had once been under Byzantine control fell into Slavic hands. The rise of the Slavs in the Balkans was particularly troubling for the Byzantine Empire. The Slavs, known for their warrior culture, were difficult to assimilate or conquer. As a result, the Byzantine Empire, instead of assimilating the Slavs, had to negotiate with them. Over time, many Slavic peoples were Christianized and integrated into Byzantine society, but their growing presence in the region marked a shift in the power dynamics of the Balkans. The Byzantine Empire was no longer the only dominant force in the area. At the same time, the remnants of the Western Roman Empire had splintered into a mosaic of Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Lombards had carved out their own kingdoms in the West, and while these groups were heavily influenced by Roman traditions, they were not bound by the same political structures. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD had created a vacuum of power, and these Germanic tribes had filled that gap. The Visigoths, for example, established their kingdom in Spain, while the Lombards took control of parts of Italy. These new forces, both in the East and West, gradually overshadowed the Byzantine Empire's once proud position as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. By the 7th century, the empire had shrunk significantly, losing vast swaths of land to the expanding Islamic Caliphate, the Frankish kingdom, and the Slavic tribes. The empire that had once controlled much of the Mediterranean world was now reduced to a shadow of its former self, clinging to a small portion of Asia Minor and the Balkans. However, even in decline, the Byzantine Empire was not without its legacy. While it lost much of its territorial holdings, its culture, law, and religious influence continued to shape the civilizations that rose in its wake. The spread of Byzantine art, architecture, and Christianity helped to lay the foundations for the future development of Eastern Europe and Russia. The Byzantine Empire's role in preserving and transmitting the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans helped to shape the intellectual landscape of the Renaissance centuries later. By the mid-6th century, the world was no longer the same as it had been a century earlier. The once mighty Byzantine Empire, having already faced numerous calamities, including plagues, famines, and territorial losses, now found itself struggling to maintain relevance in a rapidly changing world. The rise of new powers in the East and West had made it clear that the Byzantine Empire was no longer the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. One of the most significant blows to the Byzantine Empire came with the rise of the Islamic Caliphate. With the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD, the Islamic world underwent a rapid expansion that threatened the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The caliphates, particularly under the leadership of the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates, pushed the Byzantines out of the Levant, North Africa, and parts of Spain. The loss of these territories marked the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire's political and military dominance. In 636 AD, the Battle of Yarmouk, one of the decisive confrontations between the Byzantine forces and the Arab armies, led to the permanent loss of Syria, Palestine, and much of the Levant to the expanding Islamic forces. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by internal strife and the aftermath of previous disasters, was unable to defend its eastern territories against the rapid spread of Islam. In the span of just a few decades, the once thriving Byzantine Empire was stripped of its most important and wealthy provinces. Meanwhile, in the West, the rise of the Frankish kingdom, under the leadership of Clovis and later Charlemagne, began to fill the power vacuum left by the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Frankish kingdom had been expanding since the 5th century, but under Charlemagne, it solidified its place as the dominant force in Western Europe. Charlemagne's coronation as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD marked the symbolic rebirth of the Roman imperial title in the West, but this new empire was far from the Roman model that had once flourished. The establishment of the Holy Roman Empire represented a shift in European political structures. Whereas the Byzantine Empire had relied on centralized control, the Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of territories united under a single emperor, but with significant local autonomy. This system of governance marked a stark contrast to the Byzantine approach, which had been more centralized and bureaucratic. Over time, the Holy Roman Empire would evolve into a powerful political entity, though it would never fully recapture the unified strength of the Roman Empire. As the West was drawn into the rise of the Frankish kingdom, the East faced a growing threat from the Slavic peoples, who were steadily encroaching upon Byzantine territory. The Slavs, who had once been seen as a relatively isolated and peripheral group, were now establishing their own kingdoms in the Balkans. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by constant warfare and internal dissent, was no longer able to fend off these new challenges. The Slavic incursions further fragmented the empire's control over the Balkans and created a new set of power dynamics in Eastern Europe. By the time of Emperor Heraclius in the early 7th century, the Byzantine Empire had lost significant portions of its territory to the Islamic forces in the east, and its influence over Europe was diminishing. The empire's once great military was now overstretched, and the political structure that had allowed it to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries was in disarray. Heraclius, despite his best efforts, was unable to restore the empire's former glory. Instead, the Byzantine Empire was left to rebuild within a much smaller territorial framework, with Constantinople at its heart. Yet, the fall of the Byzantine Empire did not mean the end of its legacy. The Byzantine influence on art, culture, and religion would continue to reverberate throughout Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia. The spread of Christianity, carried by Byzantine missionaries, would have a profound impact on the development of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the cultural identity of the Slavic peoples. The Cyrillic alphabet, developed by Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius, would later become the foundation for many Slavic languages. Additionally, the Byzantine Empire's legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, continued to influence European legal systems long after the empire's fall. The Roman laws that had been preserved by the Byzantines would serve as the foundation for much of modern Western law, especially in countries such as France and Italy. Though the Byzantine Empire was slowly being replaced by new powers in the East and West, its influence continued to shape the political, religious, and cultural landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries to come. The fall of the Byzantine Empire was not just a moment of loss. It was the transition into a new era, one in which the legacies of both Rome and Byzantium would live on in the shaping of the future. The year 560 AD marked a significant shift in the political and religious landscape of the Byzantine Empire, a shift that would influence the empire's future for centuries. After the fall of vast territories in the east and west, and the ravaging effects of the plague, the empire found itself in a state of flux. While Emperor Justinian I had hoped to revive the grandeur of the Roman Empire, his reign had ended in 565 AD with a weakened empire in his wake. His death left a power vacuum that was further complicated by internal strife, external threats, and a world still struggling to recover from the disasters of the past decades. The early years of the 560s were marked by a struggle for control. The Byzantine Empire had long been a bastion of political and religious unity, with the emperor holding both temporal and spiritual authority. However, as the power of the Byzantine emperor waned, so too did the influence of the church. The relationship between the throne and the church became increasingly fraught, with different factions vying for influence over the state and the people. The death of Justinian I and the succession of his nephew Justin II did little to stabilize the empire. Justin II lacked the leadership qualities of his predecessor and struggled to navigate the complexities of governing a crumbling empire. The internal divisions between the ruling elites and the religious factions only deepened during this time. As the emperor's power diminished, the influence of the clergy grew, leading to religious conflict that would tear at the very fabric of Byzantine society. One of the most significant sources of unrest during this period was the religious schism between the Chalcedonian Christians, who upheld the Council of Chalcedon's doctrine of the two natures of Christ, and the Monophysites, who believed that Christ had only a divine nature. This theological disagreement was not just an abstract debate. It had real political consequences, as the Monophysites, particularly in Syria and Egypt, rejected the authority of the emperor and the church. The resulting divide fueled social unrest and violence, further destabilizing the empire. At the same time, the external threats to the empire intensified. The rise of the Slavs in the Balkans, the continued expansion of the Islamic Caliphate, and the pressure from the Turks in the east meant that the empire had to stretch its resources thin. The Byzantine army, already weakened by years of warfare, disease, and famine, was unable to respond effectively to these new threats. The empire's borders became porous, and the once mighty Byzantine navy struggled to maintain control of the Mediterranean. The political instability within the Byzantine Empire was further compounded by the actions of various provincial leaders, who increasingly sought to assert their own authority. Local military commanders and provincial governors began to act more independently, often defying the central government in Constantinople. This decentralization of power led to a breakdown in the cohesion of the empire, as regions that had once been tightly controlled by the emperor's representatives now operated with increasing autonomy. Religious unrest also played a central role in the destabilization of the empire. The Monophysite controversy, which had simmered for decades, was given new life under Justin II's reign. The emperor, who was unable to unite the empire under a single religious doctrine, found himself embroiled in theological disputes that ultimately weakened his position. The Monophysites, who had been persecuted under Justinian, now found a voice, leading to increased tensions between religious factions. In some regions, these tensions erupted into violent confrontations, further dividing an already fractured empire. In Constantinople, the people began to question the legitimacy of the emperor and the church's authority. The once proud institutions of the empire, which had stood as pillars of stability, were now viewed with skepticism and distrust. Religious leaders, who had once held considerable influence in Byzantine society, were now seen as part of a system that had failed to protect the people from the catastrophes that had befallen them. The church, which had been a unifying force in the past, now became a source of division, as various factions within it vied for control. As political and religious instability continued to erode the foundations of the empire, the question arose: could the Byzantine Empire survive this period of turmoil, or was it doomed to fall like so many great civilizations before it? The years following 560 AD marked a period of profound uncertainty and change in the Byzantine Empire. As the political and religious landscape became increasingly fractured, new religious and political movements began to rise, offering alternatives to the existing structures that had once held the empire together. These movements were driven by the desire for stability, order, and a sense of belonging in a world that had been torn apart by plagues, famine, and invasion. One of the most significant religious movements to gain traction during this time was the rise of the Monophysites, a group that believed that Christ had a single, divine nature, as opposed to the Chalcedonian doctrine, which asserted that Christ had both a divine and human nature. This theological division had been a source of tension for centuries, but in the 6th century, it reached a boiling point. The Monophysites found a strong following among the people of Egypt, Syria, and Armenia, regions that had long felt alienated from the central authority in Constantinople. The Monophysite movement was not just a theological debate, it was also deeply political. For many of its followers, the Monophysite belief system represented an opposition to the centralizing efforts of the Byzantine Empire and the authority of the emperor. In the wake of Justinian I's death, the imperial government was struggling to maintain control over the provinces, and the rise of Monophysitism provided an alternative source of leadership and unity for those who felt neglected by the central authority in Constantinople. The religious conflict between the Chalcedonian Christians and the Monophysites was not just a theological dispute. It was a conflict that divided entire communities and regions. In Egypt, where the Monophysites had strong support, tensions with the imperial government became so severe that in the early 7th century, Emperor Heraclius was forced to seek a political solution by attempting to reconcile the two factions. His attempts, however, were largely unsuccessful, and religious unrest continued to simmer, exacerbating the already fragile state of the empire. At the same time, political unrest was growing in the empire. With the emperor's weakened authority, various provincial leaders began to seize more power, creating a more decentralized and fragmented Byzantine empire. Local military commanders, who had once been subordinate to the emperor, now began to assert their own authority. The Byzantine military, once a force capable of defending the empire's borders, was now overstretched and weakened by years of war, disease, and internal conflict. As a result, military leaders in the provinces found themselves with more autonomy and less oversight from Constantinople. The rise of these provincial powers represented a major shift in the political dynamics of the empire. The once unified Byzantine state was now increasingly fractured, with different regions and cities ruled by their own leaders. In some areas, these provincial rulers were able to maintain a sense of order, but in others, the absence of central control led to chaos and instability. In the West, the power vacuum left by the decline of the Roman Empire had given rise to new political structures. The Frankish kingdom, under the leadership of King Clovis and later Charlemagne, was rapidly expanding across Europe. The rise of the Frankish Empire represented a challenge to the Byzantine Empire's influence in the West. Charlemagne, in particular, sought to revive the legacy of the Roman Empire, and his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Byzantine emperors. This growing power in the West would eventually play a crucial role in the fragmentation of Europe and the decline of the Byzantine Empire's influence. The rise of new political and religious movements, both within the Byzantine Empire and beyond, marked a period of profound transformation. The Byzantine Empire, once the beacon of Christian civilization and a symbol of Roman authority, was now facing challenges on all fronts. The empire's territorial losses to the Islamic Caliphate, the religious schism between the Chalcedonian and Monophysite Christians, and the rise of powerful regional leaders all contributed to the weakening of the empire. But even as the empire's influence waned, the cultural and intellectual legacy of Byzantium continued to resonate throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world. The preservation of Roman law, the spread of Christianity, and the Byzantine art and architecture would lay the foundations for future civilizations. Though the Byzantine Empire itself would eventually fall in 1453, its influence on the development of Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean would endure for centuries. By 560 AD, the Byzantine Empire was not simply facing internal strife. It was entering an age of uncertainty and transformation that would define its future for centuries to come. The political and religious conflicts that had gripped the empire were now beginning to take their toll on the very structures that had once held the Byzantine state together. The loss of territorial control, the increasing decentralization of power, and the unrelenting religious divisions would leave their mark on the empire long after the emperor's death. One of the most lasting legacies of this period was the growing divide between Eastern and Western Christianity. The theological rift between the Chalcedonian Christians and the Monophysites did not simply disappear after the reign of Justinian. It deepened. In fact, this divide would go on to play a major role in the eventual schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, a division that persists to this day. While the imperial court in Constantinople continued to uphold the Chalcedonian doctrine, the Monophysite factions in Syria, Egypt, and Armenia maintained their resistance, creating a fissure that would undermine the unity of the Byzantine Empire. In the midst of this religious upheaval, the imperial authority of the emperor, once a central unifying force, began to erode. The emperor was no longer seen as the unquestioned spiritual leader of the Christian world. The church, which had once been an integral part of the imperial government, now found itself increasingly at odds with the emperor. Bishops and clerics, once loyal to the throne, now began to assert their independence, leading to a further decentralization of power. The church was no longer merely a religious institution. It had become a political entity in its own right, competing with the emperor for influence over the people. The weakening of the emperor's authority was exacerbated by the empire's external challenges. The rise of Islam had already resulted in the loss of key Byzantine territories in the Middle East and North Africa. The Islamic Caliphate, which had swept across the Arabian Peninsula, now posed an existential threat to the very heart of the Byzantine Empire. The empire's ability to defend its borders was severely compromised, and the Byzantine navy, once the dominant force in the Mediterranean, was now struggling to maintain control of the seas. The continuing invasions of the Slavs into the Balkans and the continued pressure from the Lombards in Italy added to the empire's woes. With its military stretched thin and its political stability eroding, the Byzantine Empire found itself in a state of constant crisis. What had once been a unified and prosperous empire, able to withstand external and internal threats, was now a shadow of its former self. The emperor, though still the symbolic head of the state, had little real power over the empire's affairs. In the Western world, the fall of the Western Roman Empire had given rise to the Frankish kingdom, which was slowly consolidating power across Europe. Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, would go on to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, marking the revival of the imperial title in the West. The rise of the Frankish Empire, along with the consolidation of power by the papacy, was a clear sign that the political center of gravity was shifting away from Constantinople and toward Western Europe. The Carolingian Empire, under Charlemagne, would eventually rival the Byzantine Empire in terms of its influence and cultural legacy. However, despite its many challenges, the Byzantine Empire still had much to offer the world. Its rich cultural heritage, intellectual legacy, and artistic achievements would continue to shape the development of Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. The preservation of Roman law, for example, would go on to form the foundation for much of Western legal thought. Byzantine art, particularly its religious icons and mosaics, would influence the artistic traditions of Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Mediterranean for centuries. But politically, the Byzantine Empire's decline was inevitable. The loss of its territorial holdings, the fragmentation of its military power, and the ongoing religious divisions all contributed to a weakening of the central authority. The last centuries of Byzantine rule were marked by a steady decline in influence, culminating in the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The turbulence of the 6th century had set the stage for these later developments. The empire, though weakened, had left an indelible mark on history. Its legacy, though not as dominant as it had once been, would continue to influence the course of European history, particularly in the fields of law, art, and religion. The events of this turbulent era, marked by political upheaval, religious conflict, and the shifting balance of power in the Mediterranean, had transformed the world in ways that would echo for centuries to come. By the year 570 AD, the Byzantine Empire was firmly entrenched in a state of flux. It had survived the dark years of famine, plague, and war, but the question remained: how long could it endure in its weakened state? The empire was a shell of its former self, its territories fractured, and its military stretched thin. Yet, the world around it was changing rapidly, with new forces rising to challenge the old order. In the east, the Islamic Caliphate had begun its meteoric rise, and by the early 7th century, it would begin to directly challenge the Byzantine Empire's control over former territories. The rapid spread of Islam was a shock to the established political powers in the Mediterranean, including the Byzantine Empire, and its expansion was largely unstoppable at this point. It was not only a military challenge, but a cultural and religious one, as the Caliphate's monotheistic religion directly threatened the Byzantine Christian world order. At the same time, the Slavic tribes, once considered a fringe element in the northern reaches of Europe, were beginning to expand southward. They were carving out kingdoms of their own and pushing into Byzantine territory in the Balkans. The Byzantines, still reeling from their earlier losses to the Persians and the effects of the plague, were unable to put up any significant resistance to the growing Slavic presence. As the Slavs advanced, they took control of land that had once been an important part of the empire's eastern provinces. Within the empire itself, Emperor Maurice struggled to maintain control. Having ascended to the throne in 582 AD, Maurice's reign was marked by attempts to consolidate the remnants of the empire and defend it from external threats. Yet, his reign was also marked by internal strife. The Byzantine military, once the pride of the empire, had become divided. A faction of the military, displeased with Maurice's leadership, revolted in 602 AD. The revolt led to the overthrow of the emperor and the eventual disintegration of Byzantine power in the eastern Mediterranean. Maurice's deposition was not just a personal loss. It was symbolic of the crumbling authority of the imperial office. Amid these struggles, the Persians, once formidable foes of the Byzantine Empire, seemed to retreat into their own internal struggles, with the Sassanid Empire facing its own challenges. The rise of Islam in the 7th century would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Sassanid dynasty, but for now, they were less of an immediate threat to the Byzantines. However, their temporary retreat did little to stabilize the Byzantine front lines. As the Eastern Empire grappled with the rise of Islam and the internal instability caused by Maurice's fall, its grip on the Mediterranean became increasingly tenuous. Simultaneously, in the West, the rise of the Carolingian Empire under the Frankish kings began to shift the balance of power once again. While Charlemagne's reign was still decades away, the Frankish kingdoms were consolidating their power in Western Europe. By the end of the 6th century, the Frankish kingdom, especially under King Clovis and his successors, had already begun to shape the future of Europe. The western part of the former Roman Empire, once dominated by the Byzantine Empire's influence, was now increasingly under the sway of the Franks. The Frankish kingdom's growing dominance combined with the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate and the relentless march of the Slavs, signaled the decline of Byzantine power not only in the Mediterranean, but also in Europe at large. No longer the undisputed leader of the region, the Byzantine Empire was now confined to its heartland in Anatolia and the city of Constantinople. Though the empire still held a degree of influence in religious matters, particularly with the spread of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, its political dominance was being slowly eclipsed by the rise of new powers. The growing uncertainty of the times was further complicated by the fact that, despite the changing geopolitical landscape, the Byzantine Empire was still firmly entrenched in its old ways. The empire's reliance on a traditional military model, its bureaucracy, and its centralized governance were no longer as effective in the face of the new threats it was encountering. In many ways, the empire's failure to adapt to these new conditions was its undoing. The rise of Islam, the increasing fragmentation of Western Europe into feudal kingdoms, and the continued push of the Slavs into Byzantine territory presented a world on the brink of a monumental transformation. While the Byzantine Empire was still alive, it was no longer the powerful, unified entity it had once been. The empire, struggling to survive on the edge of its former power, faced a future that was uncertain, but one that was undeniably shaped by the forces of change encroaching from all directions. By the late 6th century, the Byzantine Empire was confronting not only the collapse of its military power and internal instability, but also the rise of formidable external forces. These emerging powers, particularly the Islamic Caliphate, the Frankish Kingdom, and the advancing Slavs, would reshape the geopolitical landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries to come. While the Byzantine Empire tried to maintain its grip on the region, it became increasingly clear that the empire's dominance was slipping away. The most immediate and dramatic challenge came from the Islamic Caliphate, which, in the wake of Muhammad's death in 632 AD, began its rapid expansion. The first wave of Muslim conquests, under the leadership of the Rashidun Caliphate, spread through the Arabian Peninsula, then into Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. By 636 AD, the Battle of Yarmouk decisively defeated the Byzantine army and resulted in the loss of the Levant to the Caliphate. The fall of Antioch and Jerusalem to Muslim forces was symbolic of the broader disintegration of Byzantine authority in the region. The loss of these critical provinces was not just a political and military blow, it was a religious and cultural one. Christianity, which had thrived in these regions since its earliest days, now faced a new, rapidly growing competitor. The Islamic Caliphate, united under a single religious and political leader, presented a challenge not only to Byzantine military power, but to its role as the center of Christian civilization in the East. The empire could no longer claim to be the protector of Christianity in the Holy Land, as Jerusalem and other sacred cities had now fallen into Muslim hands. The rise of Islam thus marked a profound shift in the religious and cultural authority of the Mediterranean. In the West, the Frankish kingdom was beginning to rise as a dominant power. By 500 AD, the Franks had consolidated their rule in what is now France and parts of Germany. Under the leadership of Clovis I, the Frankish kingdom had already begun to challenge the political stability of the region. However, it was the reign of Charlemagne in the 9th century that would mark the true rise of the Frankish Empire. By the time of his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, Charlemagne had effectively created a new Western Empire, one that rivaled the Byzantine Empire in terms of territorial control, military might, and cultural influence. Charlemagne's empire represented a reimagining of the old Roman imperial idea. The Holy Roman Empire, though distinct in its structure and governance, claimed to carry forward the legacy of Rome. This posed a direct challenge to the Byzantine Empire, whose emperors had long considered themselves the sole heirs to the Roman throne. While the Byzantine emperor still ruled in Constantinople, his influence was increasingly limited to the east, and the western portion of the former Roman Empire was now controlled by the Franks. The rise of the Frankish Empire in the west was a clear indication that the political power of the Byzantine Empire was being eclipsed. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, the Slavs were pushing southward, infiltrating Byzantine-controlled territories. The Slavic tribes, once thought of as a fringe element in the northern fringes of Europe, were now becoming a force to be reckoned with. By the late 6th century, Slavic groups had begun to settle in the region around the Danube River, and by the 7th century, they had reached the shores of the Aegean Sea. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal strife and military exhaustion, found itself unable to prevent the Slavic advance into the Balkans. The Slavic incursions further fragmented the Byzantine Empire's once unified borders. Instead of a cohesive political structure, the empire was now dealing with independent and often hostile factions along its borders. The Slavs, with their warrior culture and decentralized political organization, were able to exploit the Byzantine Empire's weakened state. By the early 7th century, the Slavs had established several independent kingdoms in the Balkans, effectively ending Byzantine control over much of the region. With these external forces pressing in from all sides, the Byzantine Empire found itself fighting on multiple fronts. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had once been the dominant power in the Mediterranean, was now fighting for its survival. The empire's once mighty military was overstretched, and its leadership was increasingly divided. The emperor in Constantinople struggled to maintain control over distant provinces, while the regional military commanders, often with more local knowledge, gained increasing autonomy. This shift in power from the emperor to local commanders contributed to the decentralization of the empire, a factor that would ultimately lead to its decline. While these new powers rose to challenge Byzantine control, it is important to note that the Byzantine Empire was not simply an empire in decline. The Byzantines still possessed remarkable resilience and cultural depth. The imperial court in Constantinople continued to be a center of art, education, and diplomacy. Even as the empire's territorial holdings shrank, its intellectual and cultural influence endured. The Byzantine Renaissance, a period of cultural flourishing in the 9th and 10th centuries, would continue to shape the Mediterranean world for generations. Despite the loss of territory and the rise of competing powers, the Byzantine Empire's legacy was far from over. The rise of Islam, the expansion of the Frankish kingdom, and the Slavic incursions were not just challenges to the empire's dominance. They were the catalyst for the transformation of the Mediterranean world into the complex patchwork of political and cultural entities that would define the Middle Ages. As the 6th century progressed, the Byzantine Empire, though faltering under the weight of external invasions and internal instability, continued to exert a cultural and religious influence that would resonate across the Mediterranean world for centuries. While its political and military strength were undeniably on the decline, the heart of the empire remained in Constantinople, where the Byzantines held on to the remnants of Roman legacy. However, these last vestiges of power were increasingly threatened by both rising empires and growing regional powers that saw the Byzantines as weak and ripe for challenge. At the core of the Byzantine struggle during this period was the dual challenge of maintaining the vast imperial bureaucracy while facing ever-growing threats from outside forces. Emperor Maurice, who ruled from 582 to 602 AD, sought to stabilize the empire and push back against the advancing Arab Caliphate, the Slavic invasions, and the remnants of the Persian Empire. Maurice's reign began with attempts to reform the Byzantine military and fortify the borders, but these efforts were hampered by insufficient resources, a weakened economy, and political opposition. Maurice's military reforms, which included the reduction of the empire's reliance on mercenaries and the expansion of the theme system, the military administrative districts of the empire, were designed to build a more resilient and locally focused defense structure. However, these measures would prove to be too little, too late. The Slavic tribes had already established a firm presence in the Balkans, while the Arabs were steadily conquering Byzantine territories in the east. The military and financial resources required to defend these vast borders had already been stretched thin by the empire's long-running wars with Persia, and the new threats were proving even more difficult to contain. The Slavic incursions, which had begun in the Balkans as early as the 6th century, intensified over the next decades. Slavic peoples began to settle in large numbers in the regions along the Danube River, further challenging the empire's control over the western parts of its territory. By the early 7th century, the Byzantines had lost control over much of the Balkans. The Slavs, with their decentralized and mobile structure, proved to be a difficult force to combat. They carved out their own kingdoms, and many of them adopted Christianity, often aligning with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which provided the Byzantines with some cultural influence over the region. However, political influence was another matter, and the Byzantines were unable to reclaim the territory they had lost. While the empire struggled with the military and political challenges posed by the Slavs, it was also facing the full brunt of the Islamic expansion. The Arab Caliphate, unified under the banner of Islam, began its swift conquest of former Byzantine territories after Muhammad's death in 632 AD. By 636 AD, the Byzantine army was decisively defeated at the Battle of Yarmouk, leading to the loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt to the rapidly expanding Muslim forces. The city of Jerusalem, once a key religious and strategic point for the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Muslims in 638 AD. The loss of these vital regions was a devastating blow to the Byzantine Empire, both politically and economically. Syria and Palestine were among the wealthiest provinces of the empire, providing essential revenue through trade and agriculture. Egypt, with its rich agricultural resources and strategic position along the Nile, was another critical loss. The Mediterranean, once firmly under Byzantine control, was now open to new challenges from both the Islamic fleets and the newly rising European powers. The Byzantines, once the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, now found themselves confined to the eastern shores, with Constantinople becoming their last refuge. The loss of territory also impacted the Byzantine military. Once a formidable force, the Byzantine army was now weakened by constant warfare, plagues, and famine. The loss of manpower in the earlier plague outbreaks and the depletion of military resources over decades of constant fighting made it impossible for the Byzantines to mount a successful defense against the Arabs. The military reforms attempted by Maurice, such as strengthening local militias and focusing on regional defense, were still unable to stop the larger, more organized forces of the Caliphate. In the face of these crises, the Byzantine leadership found itself fractured. Emperor Maurice's attempts to maintain unity were ultimately undermined by a military revolt in 602 AD, leading to his overthrow. The subsequent reign of Phocas, who took control through violence and political instability, only deepened the empire's internal divisions. The imperial office became increasingly weak, and the emperor's authority was no longer respected by the people or the military. Amidst the growing chaos, Constantinople remained a beacon of culture and Christianity. Despite the territorial losses, the city itself continued to thrive, holding on to its status as the center of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Byzantine architecture, such as the iconic Hagia Sophia, was a testament to the empire's cultural resilience. The church became an anchor in the chaos, serving both as a spiritual hub and a symbol of Byzantine continuity. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, under the protection of the Byzantine state, would spread to new regions, including Russia, helping to shape the future of Eastern Europe. The year 600 AD marked a pivotal moment in the history of the world, a time when new civilizations began to emerge from the shadows of the past and radically reshape the political and religious landscape. While the Byzantine Empire was still reeling from the disasters of the previous century, a new force was rising in the Arabian Peninsula, Islam. The swift expansion of the Islamic Caliphate during this period would change the course of history, challenging the Byzantine Empire's dominance and creating a new world order. By 600 AD, the Byzantine Empire, already weakened by internal strife, plague, and territorial losses, found itself facing an existential threat from the new Islamic forces sweeping across the Arabian Peninsula. The Prophet Muhammad had died in 632 AD, but his successors, the Rashidun caliphs, would lead the Muslim armies in an unprecedented wave of conquest that would overwhelm both the Byzantine and Persian empires. The impact of Islam's rise was not just military, it was also cultural and religious. The spread of Islam was swift, and it created a unified political entity in the form of the Arab Caliphate, which brought together vast regions under one rule for the first time since the Roman Empire. The message of Islam resonated across the Arabian tribes, offering a unifying faith that transcended the traditional divisions of pre-Islamic Arabia. Islam, with its focus on monotheism, community, and justice, was both a religious movement and a political revolution that reshaped the Middle East. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD was one of the defining moments of this period. It marked the end of Byzantine control over Syria and Palestine and opened the gates for further Muslim conquest. The Byzantine army, although numerically superior, was defeated by the Rashid forces, leading to the loss of the Levant to the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. This loss was devastating not only because of the strategic and economic importance of the region, but because it marked the decline of Byzantine influence in the Mediterranean and the broader Middle East. At the time of these defeats, the Byzantine Empire was still trying to recover from the series of internal crises that had plagued it throughout the 6th century. The plague of Justinian had decimated its population, leaving the empire's military weakened and its economy struggling. In addition to this, political instability continued to undermine the empire's authority. The death of Emperor Justinian I in 565 AD had left the empire without a strong central leader, and subsequent emperors, including Justinian II, struggled to maintain control. As the Islamic Caliphate expanded into Byzantine territories, the empire found itself unable to defend its borders. The once mighty Byzantine navy was no longer the dominant force it had been, and the army, drained by years of conflict and disease, was ill-equipped to face the new and formidable Muslim forces. The Byzantine leadership, unsure of how to respond to the rise of Islam, was caught in a state of disarray, while the Caliphate's forces pressed onward, capturing city after city. The rise of Islam was not only a blow to the Byzantine military, it was also a blow to the empire's religious identity. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which had been a central pillar of the Byzantine Empire, found itself in direct competition with the new monotheistic faith. The religious divide between the two empires, one Christian and the other Islamic, would define the political and cultural relationship between them for centuries to come. The rise of Islam marked the beginning of the Islamic Golden Age, a period of intellectual, cultural, and scientific achievement that would challenge the Byzantine worldview and redefine the intellectual landscape of the Middle East and beyond. In the West, the power vacuum left by the decline of the Byzantine Empire allowed new kingdoms and empires to emerge. The Franks, under the leadership of Clovis I and later Charlemagne, began to consolidate power in Europe. Charlemagne, in particular, would go on to establish the Holy Roman Empire, reviving the imperial title in the West and presenting a challenge to the Byzantine claim as the true heirs to the Roman Empire. This shift in the balance of power further isolated the Byzantine Empire, which found itself increasingly marginalized on the world stage. As the 7th century progressed, the Byzantine Empire was no longer the dominant power in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The loss of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine to the Islamic Caliphate, combined with the rise of the Frankish kingdom in the West, signaled the end of an era for the Byzantine Empire. The empire, which had once controlled vast territories from North Africa to the Balkans, now found itself reduced to a much smaller entity centered around Constantinople. This shift in power marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the Byzantine Empire would struggle to adapt to the changing dynamics of the world around it. As the Byzantine Empire continued to face existential threats from the Islamic expansion and growing regional powers, it was also undergoing significant internal transformations that would shape its future. Though the empire was clearly in decline militarily and politically, its cultural and intellectual legacy remained a beacon of continuity in a rapidly changing world. The empire's struggle for survival was now matched by its efforts to adapt to a new and increasingly hostile global order. The rise of Islam in the 7th century presented a profound challenge to the Byzantine Empire, both politically and culturally. The Byzantines, who had once been the guardians of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the heirs to the Roman Empire, now found themselves eclipsed by a new, rapidly expanding political and religious force. The Islamic Caliphate not only displaced the Byzantines from their former territories in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, but it also presented an intellectual and cultural challenge. Islam was quickly becoming the dominant force in the Mediterranean and the Near East, and the Byzantine Empire, while still holding on to Constantinople, was increasingly isolated and struggling to adapt. Despite the empire's political and military difficulties, Constantinople remained an enduring symbol of Byzantine strength and cultural resilience. It was the center of the empire's religious, intellectual, and artistic life. The Hagia Sophia, the Cathedral of Constantinople, remain an architectural marvel and a spiritual center for the Eastern Orthodox Church. The empire's rich tradition of Byzantine art, known for its religious icons and mosaics, continued to flourish, and the emperor's court in Constantinople remained a place of cultural patronage, even as the empire's political power waned. However, as the empire faced mounting external threats, it also confronted significant internal divisions. The Monophysite controversy, which had divided the church for centuries, continued to simmer. The Chalcedonian Christians, who believed that Christ was both fully divine and fully human, were increasingly at odds with the Monophysites, who believed that Christ had only a divine nature. The religious tensions were not just theological. They were political, as different factions aligned themselves with either the emperor or the church, leading to a fragmentation of religious and political unity. In the 7th century, Emperor Heraclius, who ascended the throne in 610 AD, became one of the last strong Byzantine emperors. He faced the daunting task of defending the empire from external invaders, particularly the expanding Arab Caliphate. Heraclius was forced to shift the Byzantine military strategy from a heavy reliance on land-based armies to a more flexible, defensive strategy using the navy and fortified cities. His reforms, including the creation of thematic armies, which were drawn from local populations and placed under regional commanders, helped to strengthen the empire's defenses, especially in Anatolia, but they could not prevent the loss of vast swathes of Byzantine territory to the Arabs. The Arab conquests in the early 7th century were devastating to the Byzantine Empire. In 636 AD, the Battle of Yarmouk saw the Byzantine army decisively defeated by the Muslim forces, marking the loss of Syria and Palestine. Jerusalem, a city of profound religious significance for both Christians and Jews, fell to the Muslims in 638 AD, a major blow to Byzantine prestige and control. The Byzantine Empire had long held a monopoly on the Christian holy sites in the Holy Land, and now the Muslims controlled these sacred spaces, further diminishing Byzantine authority in the region. Despite these setbacks, the Byzantine Empire continued to play a central role in the development of Christianity, even as its territorial control diminished. The Eastern Orthodox Church, under the protection of the Byzantine Emperor, began to spread its influence in the Slavic world, particularly in Russia. Missionaries like Cyril and Methodius were instrumental in converting the Slavic peoples to Christianity, establishing the Cyrillic alphabet, and spreading Orthodox Christianity to regions that would later form the Russian Empire. This was one of the enduring legacies of Byzantium, as the spread of Orthodox Christianity helped to shape the religious landscape of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The Byzantine influence on law also endured long after the empire's military power had waned. Emperor Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, continued to be studied and adopted by legal systems in Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. This legal code laid the foundation for much of Western law, and its principles influenced the development of legal systems in both the medieval period and the modern era. The persistence of Byzantine legal thought was another testament to the empire's intellectual and cultural legacy, even as its political power continued to erode. In the face of these challenges, the Byzantine Empire's resilience was tested in ways it had never been before. The loss of Jerusalem, Syria, and Egypt to the Islamic Caliphate, and the rise of the Frankish and Slavic powers, reshaped the political map of Europe and the Mediterranean. Yet, even as the Byzantine Empire shrank in size, its cultural, religious, and legal influence continued to resonate across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Near East, ensuring that the Byzantine legacy would outlive the empire itself. The fall of key Byzantine territories to the Islamic Caliphate and the rise of new political forces in Europe marked the beginning of a period of decline for the Byzantine Empire. Yet, even as its territorial power diminished, the empire's cultural, intellectual, and religious influence endured. The changes in the world during the 7th century would ripple through history, and the Byzantine legacy, though no longer politically dominant, continued to shape the Middle Ages and beyond. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire was still the leading force in terms of religion and culture. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which had grown under the protection of the Byzantine state, now became a defining institution in Eastern Europe, influencing the development of countries such as Russia, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Missionaries like Cyril and Methodius were key in spreading Orthodox Christianity to the Slavs, using the Cyrillic alphabet to translate religious texts and scriptures into the local languages. This helped to spread Christianity beyond the Byzantine borders, shaping the religious and cultural identity of Eastern Europe for centuries. The influence of Byzantine Christianity was felt not only in the conversion of the Slavic peoples, but also in the spiritual and intellectual development of these regions. In Russia, the Byzantine Church laid the groundwork for the eventual establishment of Russian Orthodoxy, which became a dominant force in the country's religious and cultural life. The Byzantine style of church architecture, with its large domes and intricate mosaics, would later be adopted by Russia and other Slavic countries, becoming a lasting symbol of their Christian faith. Byzantium's cultural legacy also endured through the arts. Byzantine mosaics, icons, and paintings became synonymous with religious expression and artistic achievement, influencing the artistic traditions of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and even Italy. The iconography developed by Byzantine artists became a foundation for later Christian religious art, with its use of symbols and stylized forms offering a deep connection to divine spirituality. Even after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Byzantine artistic traditions would continue to inspire the Renaissance and beyond, shaping European art for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire's legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, continued to serve as a major foundation for European legal systems long after the empire's fall. Justinian's law code, which codified Roman law, became a key source for later European law. In particular, it had a profound influence on the civil law systems in Europe, with countries like France, Italy, and Germany incorporating elements of Byzantine law into their own legal traditions. Even today, many of the principles of Byzantine law can still be found in modern civil law systems around the world. Despite the Islamic expansion in the East and the Frankish rise in the West, the Byzantine Empire managed to endure, if not in terms of land, then in its lasting cultural influence. Constantinople remained a powerful cultural center, even after the Ottoman Turks captured it in 1453. Byzantine scholars and intellectuals fled westward during the empire's decline, bringing with them their vast knowledge of Greek philosophy, Roman law, and classical texts. These scholars would later play a significant role in the Italian Renaissance, reviving interest in ancient Greek and Roman works, which laid the intellectual foundation for modern Western civilization. In many ways, the fall of the Byzantine Empire did not mark the end of its influence. Though its territorial losses and military defeats were devastating, the empire's cultural and religious contributions lived on. Even as the empire diminished, its legacy continued to shape the world around it. The Byzantine Empire, which had once ruled the Eastern Mediterranean, may have lost its territorial power, but its influence in religion, culture, and law left an indelible mark on the course of history. As the Islamic Caliphate expanded, Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire rose to prominence, and the Slavic kingdoms solidified their territories. The Byzantine Empire had already laid the groundwork for the development of the medieval world. The legacy of the Byzantine Empire lived on in the religions and legal systems it helped to shape, the art it produced, and the intellectual traditions it preserved. Its contributions to the world were profound, even as it became a memory, a shadow of what it once was. By the year 610 AD, the Byzantine Empire was at crossroads. The empire, once a mighty force in the Mediterranean, had endured more than its fair share of calamities. Its territories had been reduced by the advance of the Islamic Caliphate, and its once unstoppable military had been weakened by centuries of internal strife, disease, and external invasions. The people of the empire had witnessed the rise and fall of great emperors, only to find themselves staring into an uncertain future. It was at this critical juncture that Heraclius, a man who would come to be remembered as one of the greatest emperors in Byzantine history, ascended to the throne. His rise was not smooth. Heraclius had to fight for his position, taking the imperial throne from the unpopular and ineffective Emperor Phocas in a coup. Heraclius, a member of the powerful Heraclian family, was a skilled military leader and strategist, and his reign would come to define the future of the Byzantine Empire. Heraclius' early reign was marked by turmoil. The empire was under immediate threat from both the Islamic Caliphate in the east and the Slavic incursions in the Balkans. The Sassanid Persians, who had been long-standing rivals to the Byzantines, were also a constant threat. The Sassanid Empire, which had once been a formidable adversary, had been weakened by the plague and internal strife, but it still posed a serious danger to the Byzantine Empire. The Persian Empire had successfully taken significant Byzantine territories, including Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Now, Heraclius was faced with the dual challenge of defending the empire's eastern borders from both the Islamic expansion and the continuing Persian threat. Heraclius, however, was determined to not only defend the empire, but also to reverse its declining fortunes. His first significant military campaign was against the Persians, who had been raiding Byzantine lands for decades. The Persian invasion had begun in 602 AD under Emperor Khosrow II, who had captured significant portions of the Byzantine Empire. By the time Heraclius took the throne, the Persians controlled much of the eastern Byzantine territories. The loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had left the Byzantine Empire vulnerable and nearly crippled its ability to project power. Determined to restore the empire's power, Heraclius reorganized the Byzantine military. He adopted a strategy of aggressive warfare against the Persians, personally leading campaigns to retake Byzantine lands. His military innovations were key to his success, particularly his use of the Byzantine navy, which allowed him to gain crucial victories along the Mediterranean coast. In 627 AD, after years of fierce fighting, Heraclius achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Nineveh, defeating the Persian forces and forcing Khosrow II to flee. The Sassanid Empire was on the brink of collapse, and Heraclius was able to reclaim most of the lost territories, including Syria, Palestine, and Armenia. Heraclius' military victories brought the empire a much-needed period of stability, but his success was not without consequences. The wars with the Persians and the continuous fighting with the Arabs had taken a heavy toll on the empire. Heraclius, though victorious, was left with a weakened and exhausted empire. The military campaigns had drained the imperial treasury, and the cost of maintaining the Byzantine army was crippling. The empire had survived, but it was on the brink of financial collapse. The legacy of Heraclius' reign, therefore, would be a mixture of both triumph and devastation. A victory against the Persians, but a Pyrrhic one that left the Byzantine Empire vulnerable to new threats. In addition to his military achievements, Heraclius is remembered for his religious reforms. One of his most significant acts was the religious transformation of the empire. Heraclius, a devout Christian, sought to unify the empire under a single religious banner. The religious controversies that had plagued the empire for centuries, particularly the Monophysite controversy, had divided the people and weakened the central authority of the emperor. Heraclius sought to resolve these divisions by embracing the Chalcedonian doctrine and attempting to reconcile the various Christian factions. This religious transformation was not without resistance. The Monophysites, who believed that Christ had a single divine nature, opposed Heraclius' efforts to impose the Chalcedonian doctrine. Tensions between the two factions would continue to simmer throughout Heraclius' reign, leading to a greater division within the empire. Nonetheless, Heraclius' religious reforms helped to solidify the role of the Eastern Orthodox Church as the spiritual heart of the Byzantine Empire, further entrenching Christianity as the empire's guiding force. As Heraclius continued his military successes and began to restore the territories of the Byzantine Empire, his reign was also marked by a significant religious transformation. Religion, as it always had been in the Byzantine world, was intertwined with politics, and the emperor's role as both the secular and spiritual leader of the empire gave him enormous influence over religious matters. Heraclius, more than any of his predecessors, sought to solidify the Byzantine Empire's Christian identity and resolve the deep theological disputes that had plagued the empire for centuries. One of the most pressing issues that Heraclius faced was the Monophysite controversy, a religious schism that had divided the Eastern Christian Church for over a century. The Monophysites, who believed that Christ had only a single divine nature, rejected the Chalcedonian doctrine, which held that Christ was both fully divine and fully human. This theological rift was not merely a matter of abstract doctrine. It had political, cultural, and social ramifications that contributed to the instability within the Byzantine Empire. The Monophysite movement had found strong support in regions like Syria, Egypt, and Armenia, where the doctrine was embraced by large segments of the population. The tension between the Chalcedonian and Monophysite Christians had led to unrest, with both groups often at odds with one another. The Church, which was supposed to be a unifying force, was instead a source of division within the empire. Theologically, it threatened the unity of Christian belief in the empire, and politically, it undermined the authority of the emperor, as different factions supported different ecclesiastical leaders. In an effort to heal this religious divide and secure the unity of the empire, Heraclius sought to reconcile the two factions. His approach, however, was not to impose a definitive resolution to the theological dispute. Instead, he attempted a diplomatic solution. Heraclius issued a series of edicts known as the Ecthesis, published in 638 AD, and later the Typos, issued in 648 AD, which attempted to find a middle ground between the Chalcedonian and Monophysite positions. His aim was to establish an official imperial doctrine that would be acceptable to both sides. These edicts emphasized the unity of Christ's nature, but avoided making definitive statements about the exact nature of Christ's divinity and humanity, in an attempt to pacify both factions. Unfortunately for Heraclius, these reforms were met with resistance. The Monophysites, who had hoped for a more decisive move towards their beliefs, were dissatisfied with Heraclius' attempts at compromise. The Chalcedonian Christians, on the other hand, were also unhappy with the ambiguous nature of the Ecthesis and Typos. The failure of these religious reforms left the Monophysite controversy unresolved, and the divide between the two factions remained a source of tension within the empire for many years. Heraclius, however, was not deterred by these religious struggles. He continued to champion the Chalcedonian doctrine, which was supported by the Church in Constantinople, and he sought to maintain the authority of the Eastern Orthodox Church as the central religious institution in the empire. This period saw the strengthening of the Patriarchate of Constantinople as the main authority in the Eastern Orthodox Church, further consolidating the emperor's religious power. Despite the ongoing theological disputes, Christianity remained a unifying force in the empire, particularly in the eastern regions, where the influence of the Byzantine Church was deeply ingrained in the culture and everyday life. In addition to his efforts to resolve religious tensions within the empire, Heraclius also sought to strengthen the Byzantine Empire's relationship with the Papal See in Rome. While the Pope in Rome had traditionally held a degree of independence from the Eastern Church, Heraclius understood the importance of aligning with the papacy in the face of the growing Muslim threat. The rise of Islam, which was rapidly spreading across the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, presented an existential threat to both the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. Heraclius understood that the empire and the papacy needed to work together if they were to survive the coming storm. Heraclius' religious policies, however, were not without their drawbacks. The division between the Chalcedonians and Monophysites persisted, and the Islamic conquests in the 7th century would soon overshadow the religious disputes of the Byzantine Empire. The rise of Islam was not only a military and political challenge, but also a religious one, as the Islamic Caliphate spread across the Mediterranean and into the heart of Byzantine-controlled territories. As the 7th century unfolded, the legacy of Heraclius became increasingly evident in the Byzantine Empire, particularly in the way it faced external pressures and internal transformations. His military successes in the East and his religious reforms left an indelible mark on the empire, but his reign also highlighted the vulnerabilities that would shape the empire's future. Despite his triumphs, the empire was still on the edge of transformation, with new threats emerging and old challenges remaining. The Islamic expansion, which had begun just a few years before Heraclius took the throne, continued to pose the most serious challenge to the Byzantine Empire. By 636 AD, following the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantines had lost their key territories in the Levant, including Syria, Palestine, and Jerusalem, to the rapidly expanding Arab Caliphate. These regions, once the heart of Byzantine Christianity, now lay under the control of Muslim forces. This loss was not only political and military, but also deeply religious. The holy cities of Jerusalem and Alexandria, important centers of Christian culture, were now in Muslim hands, signaling the end of the Byzantine monopoly over Christianity's most sacred sites. Despite the military setbacks, Heraclius' reforms laid the foundation for the Byzantines to fight back. His military reorganization, which included the creation of the thematic army system, where regional military commanders took charge of local defense, proved essential for the empire's survival in the years that followed. This system allowed for more efficient and flexible responses to the growing threats from both the Arab invaders and the Slavs encroaching on the empire's borders. However, Heraclius' decision to shift much of the empire's focus to the east, while necessary for the defense against the Islamic threat, came at the cost of the empire's western territories. North Africa and Italy, both once crucial to the empire's economic stability, were largely lost during his reign. The Frankish kingdom under Clovis and later Charlemagne was consolidating power in the west, threatening the Byzantine influence in Italy and establishing the Holy Roman Empire. This growing power in the west would later challenge the Byzantine claim to being the true heirs of the Roman Empire. The Slavic invasions in the Balkans further complicated the situation for the Byzantine Empire. By the early 7th century, the Slavic peoples, originally considered fringe or peripheral tribes, had begun to settle in the regions formerly under Byzantine control. These groups, while not unified in the same way as the Arabs or Franks, spread across the Balkans, Greece, and parts of Italy, further eroding Byzantine authority. The Slavic incursions not only diminished the empire's territorial holdings, but also disrupted its ability to defend itself from the mounting threats in the east and west. In the east, the Arab Caliphate continued to grow, with Damascus serving as its capital after the conquest of the Byzantine Levant. This marked the beginning of a new world order, where the Islamic world became a dominant cultural, political, and military force, challenging both the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persians. Although the Sassanid Empire had been weakened by years of conflict with the Byzantines, it, too, succumbed to the rise of Islam, and its eventual fall in 651 AD left the Arab Caliphate as the preeminent power in the region. Heraclius, in the face of these growing external pressures, sought to secure the empire's future by strengthening the core of the Byzantine state, Constantinople. The city, which had survived sieges, plagues, and famines over the centuries, remained the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Heraclius invested in the fortifications of Constantinople, ensuring its continued survival as the empire's center of administration, culture, and religion. However, even the mighty walls of Constantinople, which had been impregnable for centuries, could not shield the empire from the encroaching forces of Islam and the inevitable decline of Byzantine power. Internally, Heraclius' religious reforms, though well-intentioned, failed to bring about the unity he had hoped for. The Monophysite controversy, which had split the empire for decades, continued to divide the people. Heraclius' attempts at compromise with the Monophysites through his ekthesis and typos documents were met with resistance from both sides. Despite his efforts to settle the theological dispute, the divide between Chalcedonian and Monophysite Christians persisted. This unresolved religious schism remained a significant factor in the Byzantine Empire's internal struggles and contributed to its inability to fully unite against external threats. Heraclius' death in 641 AD marked the end of an era for the Byzantine Empire. He had been one of the last strong emperors who could still claim imperial authority over a fragmented and declining empire. In the wake of his death, the Byzantine Empire faced a rapidly shifting world, where its cultural and religious influence remained, but its political and military power was no longer what it once was. The rise of Islam, the fragmentation of the empire's western holdings, and the growing pressure from the Slavs would all contribute to a long period of decline for the Byzantine Empire. Yet, despite these challenges, the Byzantine legacy would endure. The empire's legal traditions, its Christianity, and its cultural influence would continue to shape the Eastern Orthodox world and later contribute to the intellectual and cultural developments of the Renaissance. Heraclius' reign, though marked by immense challenges, provided the framework for Byzantine survival in the face of overwhelming odds. Hey there, history enthusiasts! You've just witnessed one of the most fascinating and often forgotten chapters of human history, where empires fell, new powers emerged, and the world as we knew it was forever altered. The Byzantine Empire, the rise of Islam, the creation of new kingdoms, all of these moments have shaped the world we live in today. But the journey doesn't stop here, and neither should your curiosity. We've only scratched the surface of this epic tale. Imagine a world where one empire's collapse triggers a ripple effect, changing religions, politics, and societies forever. Imagine what happens next, as new civilizations, ideologies, and leaders rise from the ashes, each one contributing a unique thread to the tapestry of human history. If you found yourself captivated by how the Byzantine Empire's struggle for survival shaped the future of Europe and the Mediterranean, then you won't want to miss what's coming next. The twists, the turns, the challenges. This story isn't over. Why should you stay with us? Our deep dives don't just skim the surface. We're bringing you the lesser-known details that textbooks leave out. Ever wondered how the Byzantine Empire managed to survive despite its vulnerabilities? Or the untold stories behind the rise of the Frankish kingdom? Or how the Slavic invasions completely altered the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean? We'll answer those questions and so much more. Our community is full of passionate history buffs, and we're all about building a place where we can talk, debate, and learn together. Drop your comments below with your favorite historical tidbits, questions, or theories, and engage with like-minded viewers who share your passion for the past. Your opinions matter, and we want to hear them. We're not just leaving you hanging. We've got plenty of exciting content lined up that will keep you glued to the screen. Here's a little preview. The rise of Charlemagne. How did one man's ambition help establish the Holy Roman Empire and shift the balance of power in Europe? The Crusades and their legacy. We'll dive deep into the complex and often misunderstood history of the Crusades, unraveling the forces that drove these religious wars and their lasting impact on Europe and the Middle East. The fall of Constantinople, a tragic yet fascinating tale of the Ottoman Turks' siege of the Byzantine capital, marking the end of an era and the dawn of a new world order. The Viking Age and its impact on Europe. Discover how the terrifying yet ingenious Vikings forever changed the European landscape with their raids and explorations. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're constantly exploring new periods, new ideas, and fresh perspectives that you won't find anywhere else. This is the place to unravel history, not just memorize it. When you subscribe, you're not just hitting a button. You're joining a community that's passionate about learning. You're making a commitment to your future self, the self that will be able to confidently discuss history, culture, and politics with others, understand how the past shapes the present, and never be left out of a good historical debate again. But it's more than that. Subscribing gives you first access to new videos. Get notified as soon as new videos drop. Whether it's an explosive take on a major historical event or a deep dive into a forgotten chapter, you won't miss a thing. You'll also get exclusive insights. Our community gets early previews, special videos, and behind-the-scenes insights into upcoming content. Want to have your questions answered in future videos? Leave a comment, and we might just feature you. Plus, you'll receive weekly updates. We don't just post one-off videos. With consistent uploads, you'll always have a fresh dose of history coming your way, keeping you on the edge of your seat and hungry for more. We understand that there are a lot of channels out there, but we don't just want to be another YouTube subscription on your list. We want to be the channel that sparks your curiosity, the channel you look forward to watching each week, and the channel where you feel at home. Your engagement fuels our passion for making high-quality, deeply researched, and emotionally engaging content. So, don't just watch, become part of the journey. With each video, you're not just gaining knowledge, you're becoming a part of a larger conversation about where we've been and where we're headed.